The next part is assessing the range of motion, or ROM. I'm gonna do the flexion, extension, and hyperextension of neck pivot joint. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension of neck pivot joint. And now I'm gonna do is the lateral flexion of neck pivot joint. Sideways. Now the rotation of neck pivot joint. Now I'm gonna do the flexion, extension, and hyperextension of shoulder ball socket joint. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension of shoulder ball socket joint. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Next is abduction and adduction of shoulder ball socket joint. Abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. Next is the circumduction of shoulder ball socket joint. And now the flexion and extension of elbow hinge joint. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension. And now I'm gonna do the internal rotation of elbow hinge joint and internal rotation of shoulder ball socket joint. Internal, external, internal, external. Next is the rotation of elbow hinge joint and the pronation of elbow hinge joint. Supination, pronation, supination, pronation. And now the flexion, extension, and hyperextension of wrist condyloid joint. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension of wrist condyloid joint. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Next is the radial and ulnar wrist condyloid joint. Radial and ulnar. Radial and ulnar, also known as abduction and adduction. Now, the flexion, extension, and hyperextension of wrist condyloid joint. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension of wrist condyloid joint. Now, the abduction and adduction of wrist condyloid joint. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. And now, the flexion, extension of thumb saddle joint. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. Now, is the abduction and adduction of thumb saddle joint. Adduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. And now is the opposition of thumb saddle joint. Now is the flexion, extension, and hyperextension of hip ball and socket joint. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Now is the abduction and adduction of hip ball and socket joint. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Now is the circumduction of hip ball and socket joint. Circular motion. Next is the internal and external rotation of hip ball and socket joint. Internal, external. Internal, external. Right after that is the flexion, extension of knee hinge joint. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. And after that is the flexion, extension, and hyperextension of toes. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Next is the extension, hyperextension, flexion, extension, and hyperextension of trunk gliding. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Next is the lateral trunk gliding. And now is the rotation of trunk gliding. And that is the end of the assessment.